My name is Jamie Sullivan, and I am the manager for the National Center for Rural Road Safety. Today's webinar will last about an hour and a half. As I've mentioned before, we do have a few poll questions around the side of the webinar system. It looks like most people are joining us by both computer and phone today, but we do have a few computer-only people. We have a pretty good mix of where everyone is joining us from today, mainly the Southeast, Midwest, and Western, but we do have a few people joining us from the Northeast. I'm going to close out these polls as we go through right now. Most people are joining us by themselves in their offices, but we do have a few groups of 2 to 3, 4 to 5, and 10 and up, so thank you all for joining us. And for those of you who are joining us in big groups, if the person who did register for the webinar could please send us an email or put into the chat pod emails for those other people who are joining you. At the close of today's webinar, we will be sending out an evaluation form. That evaluation should go to everyone, so if you could send us all of their emails, that would be great. That's the only way to be able to sign up to receive certificates of completion for the webinar and also CEUs. So it is important that we have everybody's email, if you wouldn't mind sending that to us. And it looks like the majority of people today are joining us from state departments of transportation, but we do have a few locals and a few universities and also a few federal people as well. So again, thank you all for joining us. And first, we're going to start with a few webinar logistics. Our webinar today is running from 9 to 10:30 Mountain Time. Like I just mentioned, we are offering CEUs for this webinar. And so when you do receive the evaluation shortly after today's completion, one of the last questions will ask whether or not you're interested in those CEUs. If so, please check the box and enter your email address. We will send the forms that you'll need to fill out in order to receive those CEUs from Montana State University. If you do not want CEUs but are interested in a certificate of completion, you can also check for that as well, and we'll send that to you as well. It will take a few weeks for each of these things to come to you, as we do wait until all of the evaluations have come in, and we give you about a week and a half to fill those out. This webinar is also being recorded. It will be available within a few days on our archive trainings page on our website. Please ensure that if you are on the phone that you turn your computer speakers down all the way, otherwise you are going to have some feedback. And we have also had a few challenges with the audio for people who are streaming, especially if you're on Wi-Fi. So if you are having audio challenges where it does cut in and out, we would ask that you call in on a phone line as you'll have better audio that way. Please, if your phone already is on mute for all of the audience, but if you are one of the speakers, as I mentioned before, if you aren't speaking, if you could put your phone on mute just so everyone won't hear background noise. To maximize your presentation, there is 4 arrows up in your top right-hand corner that you can press, and that will make the presentation and PowerPoint slides as big as they can get on your computer screen for easier viewing. And at the end of each section that we have today, there will be time for question and answers. And you can direct those via the chat pod, which is on the left-hand side of your screen. Today we have 4 presenters that will be presenting for you. We have Professor Nick Ward, who is the Director of the Center for Health and Safety Culture and also a professor at Mechanical and Industrial Engineering at Montana State University, Bozeman. Nick obtained his PhD in Human Factors Psychology from Queen's University in Canada, and as a founding member of the National Summit for Rural Traffic Safety Culture and the Transportation Research Board Subcommittee on Road Safety Culture, he is a national leader in the U.S. for the definition and advancement of traffic safety culture. We also have today Rudy Malfabon, who is the Director of the Nevada Department of Transportation. Rudy was appointed to the position of Director of Nevada DOT in September 2012. He has worked for over 27 years for Nevada DOT, starting his career in the field of construction. In his present position as director, he seeks to improve communication, coordination, and improve customer service with local agency partners, elected officials, and the general public. We also will have Mike Tooley, who is the director of the Montana Department of Transportation. He was appointed to that position in 2012. As the director, he serves as the member of the board of directors for AASHTO and serves on AASHTO's Standing Committee on Highway Traffic Safety. Prior to being appointed MDT director, Mike was sworn into the Montana Highway Patrol in 1984 and was appointed chief of Montana Highway Patrol in 2009. So he holds both the law enforcement and the Department of Transportation sectors. Lastly, we have Mark Shelton, who is a district engineer for the Missouri Department of Transportation for the Southeast District. The district covers 25 counties in southeast Missouri. Mark is responsible for all operations in the district, including maintenance, construction, and traffic engineering. He is also the team leader for Missouri DOT's statewide safety focus team, which is a multidisciplinary team charged with moving Missouri DOT forward with keeping ourselves and our customers safe. He has 30 years of experience with Missouri DOT in a variety of geographic locations within the state. And so we are very happy to have all four of these presenters today to talk to you about the NCHRP Domestic Scan 1403. And I'm going to turn the webinar over now to Nick Ward, who's going to talk a little bit more about this.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got a couple of goals for the presentation. Recently conducted, along with my colleagues you just heard from and some others, a Domestic Scan 1403, which was tasked with the goal of trying to understand what it is about organizations that have been able to successfully transform their safety culture to strengthen that safety culture and prioritize safety. And in this seminar today, we want to talk about what we learned from our methodology in terms of the factors that were in place that seem to help these organizations create a strong safety culture, and what were some of the common processes they went through to enable them to reach their goal of transforming their culture. So there are several specific learning outcomes that we hope to accomplish in today's webinar. The first is to understand the basic methodology that we use in the domestic scan. The second is to recognize the definition and relevance of organization safety culture. Third is to list the factors that help an organization be ready to change its culture based on the findings from the scan. And identify the process through which organizations change can be supported, again, taking lessons from the organizations we interviewed and collected data from in the scan. And finally, share some of the key insights the domestic scan panel gained from the scan about the principles and strategies that can successfully change organization safety culture. I'll just start off with giving an overview of the basic methodology of the scan, as well as a definition of safety culture and why it's relevant to organization success. First of all, we can start off with the premise that traffic safety agencies are responsible for ensuring the safety of road users. And it's difficult to achieve that goal successfully if the agency itself has a culture that may not value safety as strongly as it could. So for an organization to fulfill its responsibility to ensure the safety of road users, it helps if that agency has a strong safety culture itself. So how can such agencies develop a strong safety culture to support their mandate to ensure the safety of road users? In this domestic scan, we looked at examples of success and lessons learned from other agencies, both in transportation and out in the commercial sector, to see what they did to successfully transform their safety culture, with the hope of learning some lessons and some guiding principles that could let other agencies do the same and transform their own organization safety culture. The methodology itself involved recruiting 6 organizations that had a reputation for a strong safety culture. That include the public sector, state DOTs, for example, and the private sector, a couple of private companies that were involved in safety critical aspects. The methodology itself to collect the data, first of all, it was based on a survey. The survey, it was designed to be sent to these organizations to ask them about the presence of certain factors that may have been in the organization at the time they transformed their culture, to see which of those factors the organization thought was critical to their success. The second aspect of the survey was to ask about particular processes they may have gone through, stages of development and evolution they may have gone through to implement their transformation of culture. After we got back those surveys, the panel reviewed the answers, and as a team developed some supplemental follow-up questions which we sent to the organizations to provide some additional data. We then had the panel meet with the organization leaders, and each organization made a presentation on the factors and processes they went through in transforming their culture. And during those meetings, the domestic panel asked questions and took notes and so forth. And at the end, the domestic panel reviewed all the data from the surveys, supplemental questions, meeting notes during their presentations, and began to consolidate conclusions and develop a framework for the report that will be produced for this domestic scan. Domestic scan is shown here. A number of representatives from different state DOTs as well as a representative from Federal Highway. All communicated by phone or by email as well as in-person meetings. The chair was Rudy from Nevada DOT. And the participating organizations here, we have Public with Minnesota DOT, Iowa DOT, Federal Highway, and the Washington Traffic Safety Commission participated as public traffic safety entities. And from the private sector, we had Granite Construction that does heavy construction, and Monsanto does agricultural work. The goal was, again, was to select organizations that had a reputation for a strong organizational safety culture, so that the panel could try and investigate what factors and what processes allowed these organizations to achieve a strong safety culture, in hope that those lessons and those principles could be translated to other organizations that may want to transform their culture too. So we can talk about what we mean by organizational culture. This was one of the first tasks the panel had to deal with. If you're doing a domestic scan on what it means to successfully grow a strong safety organizational culture, it helps if we can all agree on what we mean by organizational culture in general and safety culture specifically. And this is a common model and definition that's used to represent what we mean by organizational culture. It starts with a paradigm. It's basically the values that define the priorities and missions of an organization. So an organization with a strong safety culture would value safety as a high priority, and that would be one of its main missions, is to support safety for its own employees and those that they serve. The next aspect of organizational culture are its strategies, which is essentially its beliefs as to what efforts it can do that will be effective in achieving its mission. So what are their beliefs, for example, about ways that you can reduce safety or improve safety, rather? What are the general things that work in improving safety? And then last, institutions and organizations may codify their paradigm and their strategies into artifacts. So a good example would be state highway safety planning documents, where they articulate their missions and their goals, and they espouse their particular strategies that they believe will be effective in achieving those goals. So more literally, we actually just use the US DOT definition of what we mean by safety culture within an organization, namely the shared values and behaviors that demonstrate a commitment to safety over competing goals. And the previous diagram I showed, as well as this particular definition, is what we use to introduce the survey to the participating organizations and to help us construct the survey questions itself. believe, Jimmy, you want to do something here?
Yes, thank you, Nick. For right now, we are going to open up for questions. As I mentioned before, you can use the chat pod on the left-hand side to type in any questions you may have, and then Nick can answer them. While we are doing that, I'm going to move over. We do have 2 polls for you as well right now. The chat pod is still over on the left-hand side for you. So our first question is, of the participating organizations right now, how many of you want to improve your safety culture, and how many have recently undergone a strategic effort to improve your safety culture? And so it looks like there's about 78% of you do want to improve your safety culture, and about 42% of you have recently undergone a strategic effort to improve the safety culture. While we are waiting to see if there are any questions, we do have one more poll question for you. How would you describe the safety culture of your organization currently? Strong, mixed, weak, or unsure? Okay, and Nick, I have those results showing. They should be showing for you right now if you'd like to discuss those ones.
Question 6.
Yep.
Well, it looks like 24% of us think we already have strong cultures. Majority, 73%, seem to indicate that it's a mixed safety culture, which I would presume means that it's mixed in terms of different levels of safety culture across different facets of the organization, which is not uncommon. Quite often different divisions or different sectors of an organization have different perceived responsibility for safety, so therefore could have a different level of culture. What's often useful, of course, is to have all the segments of an organization aligned with the common goal and at the same level of safety culture. So it may not always be the case of needing to move the entire organization toward stronger safety culture. It may be more just finding those segments of the organization which don't yet recognize their role in the safety mission and to help them move forward with their transformation of culture.
And Nick, while I do move us back over to the presentation, it looks like we have one question. What are some ways to recognize an organization's culture?
Great question. If we're defining safety culture as essentially the values and beliefs that prioritize safety over other goals, that's sometimes unspoken, so we need to look for observable manifestations of that culture. And some of the more common ways of identifying what the culture of an organization might be would be looking at their artifacts. So to what extent do the documentations and websites and procedures and organization of the culture, to what extent do all those physical manifestations that sort of run the organization, to what extent can you recognize in those that value, the value of safety, and that value of safety is prioritized? Another way of looking at the culture is to sort of look at the behaviors, excuse me, the behaviors and actions of the organization, especially the leaders, and seeing if those behaviors and actions are consistent with a strong safety culture. For example, things like budget allocation and so forth. One needs to be careful, of course, when you're inferring the underlying reason for a person's behaviors and actions. It may be for other reasons than culture. They may be just constrained for other external factors and they're forced to make the particular decision. but generally speaking, looking at artifacts and looking at behaviors is one way of inferring an organization's culture. The more direct approach, of course, is to tap into those actual values and beliefs, which is why we did a survey in this study to actually ask people what their beliefs and values are, given that that is consistent with the definition of what we mean by culture. So interviewing, discussion, surveying, getting directly to people's values and beliefs and attitudes is the most direct way of assessing culture. In that respect, you can often pick up culture from the conversations and stories people tell within their organizations. An organization with a strong safety culture will often have people talking about their accomplishments and successes and the importance to them of those particular values and beliefs. Okay, Jimmy?
Perfect. Thank you, Nick. And your slides are ready to go for the second section.
Okay, thank you. So at this point, I want to move over to discussing some of the factors that we identified can help an organization when they seek to change their culture, as well as some of the key stages of process through which an organization could move to achieve their goal of transforming culture. So one of the questions that we had in the survey that we sent out to the organizations that had been invited to participate because of their reputation for a strong safety culture, we asked them about the presence or absence of certain factors that may have existed at the time they began their initiative to transform culture. Asked them whether they were present or not, and asked them how important they felt it was to have those factors present when they were trying to change their culture. And these comes from a list of factors that the research on organizational transformation has identified as being commonly useful, and the organizations reaffirmed that a number of these were indeed very important to have in place to support the effort to transform culture. And their first six are listed here. Management and leadership within the organization are publicly committed to safety. The organization emphasizes safety as part of its internal and public image. The organization has a vision for the goal, what success looks like, of the safety culture initiative. Safety goals are formalized in organization planning and strategic documents. That's the part I mentioned earlier about artifacts. The organization has policies and equipment that promote and support safety in the workplace. Number 6, failure of safety can be catastrophic and impact the public reputation of the organization. So these are 6 factors that organizations that we spoke to who had managed to change their safety culture felt were present and important to their success. Moving on to the process itself, if we identified previously those 6 factors that were most commonly deemed to be critical to the success of those organizations who made efforts to change their culture, we also asked questions and interviewed the organizations to understand the process they went through to implement their strategies to transform culture, and which steps in this process were important to the success and their achievement of their goal. To do that, we had to go back to the literature again and identify from the literature a model that represents what's deemed to be sort of the more important stages for transforming culture within an organization. Now, there are several types of models out there that one could use, and we just happened to use Cotter's 8-step model because we found it intuitive, clean, and relevant for our particular purposes. So when we were designing the questions to ask people what they actually did and how they went about doing it, we wanted to use a model like this to give us some kind of rational structure to the questions we were asking. We were fearful of asking questions like, how did you change your culture? That we might get such a broad array of answers that we wouldn't really be able to find some common factors. So instead, we used an existing process model to help us ask specific questions that would allow us to get to the heart of the data more easily. So this is the process that we use, Cotter's model. It's summarized here on the slide for you. I'll walk through it briefly, but essentially we ask questions of the organizations for each of these stages of the process, what they actually did, what they felt was a success factor, and what they felt was an impediment. so that we could actually have examples at each stage of this process for how to implement this process and be successful in transforming culture. And the final report is broken out this way to sort of discuss across the organizations what some of the key successful actions were and some of the key examples of particular strategies that the different organizations used at each stage of this process. So just briefly walking through the stages, the first stage is to establish and maintain a sense of urgency, to use data to make it clear to the organization that this need to change the safety culture is important and why it's important, and to maintain that sense of urgency through the entire process so that people maintain their motivation to achieve that cultural transformation. Number two, to initiate the transformation in culture, you need to form a powerful guiding coalition. This will involve leadership, but also people on the ground, people who have influence, people who are what we would call transformational leaders, charismatic leaders, who can maintain the vision, maintain the motivation, but also have the influence to make changes that are necessary to move forward. Number three, create a vision of change. It's important that the organization members actually can visualize what they're aiming for, that they can actually sense what the goal is. They can actually visualize what it would be like to reach that goal. That gives them clarity on the purpose of the transformation process, but also maintains their motivation. Communicating that vision, everyone needs to know in the organization what the vision is, what their role is in achieving that vision. That just gets the effort widely accepted across the organization and have everybody on board and moving forward. Empowering action for the vision. It's not enough just to say, hey, let's do this. You have to go in and see what you need to change within your organization to allow you to move forward to that vision. That may involve adding more resources, adding some new procedures. It also involves looking at what are the existing impediments in the organization. There might be some structural issues or policy issues which are preventing you moving forward to your vision. So you need to look at both. What can we do to empower people to move forward and implement the strategy of transforming culture, and what do we need to rethink and revise and remove from how we currently do things now? Number six, plan for and create short-term wins. To maintain momentum and to help everybody recognize that this transformation is possible, you need to set up a procedure for setting short-term goals and celebrating those short-term goals as you move forward to your longer-term vision. So a way of identifying and rewarding success early and making that a public celebration with rewards and so forth lets people maintain their motivation and see that this is a credible process that we're going through. Consolidate and build on the change as you move forward. Use those successes to consolidate your overall effort, to recruit more support, to gain more momentum, to build on those short-term wins and keep moving toward your long-term goal. And number six, once you sort of move to your goals, your end goal state of a stronger cultural safety culture and organization, you need to anchor those changes and the changes you made to get to this point into your broader organizational culture, such as the wider policies, procedures, structures, other artifacts, so that your changed culture and the various modifications you made to support that new safety culture becomes codified and embodied in the artifacts of your organization, so it becomes integral with how your organization thinks and works moving forward. So this is one example of a process model for organizational change. We use this as a framework, as I said, to understand how these organizations, what process they went through to transform their safety culture, and the final report, which will come out at some point, will discuss what some of these organizations did at each level of this process to make this process more concrete and something that other organizations may want to follow as they seek to transform their own culture. Back to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Nick. And once again, we're opening up for some questions. If you would like to put in any questions you may have into the chat pod over on the left-hand side, and we'll ask those of Nick. We do have one more poll question for you as well at this point. Which of the following factors are currently absent in your agency? Management and leadership within the organization are publicly committed to safety. The organization emphasizes safety as part of its internal and public image. The organization has a vision for goals or success of the safety culture program. Safety goals are formalized in organization planning and strategic documents. And the organization has policies and equipment that promote and support safety in the workplace. And please check all that apply to your organization. And Nick, while we're waiting to see if any more questions come in, one that we do have is, what do you think is the most important step in the process to change culture?
Well, not to be glib, but I think the first one. Maybe the first two. I mean, obviously the way that Cotter set up his process is done in a particular sequence. But the first one, unless you actually create a sense of urgency as to why this change needs to take place, the whole effort won't have enough credibility to move forward. Number two, building the coalition. Unless you have the right people who have influence and the authority to make the changes necessary, it may be hard to make the changes that are required to move forward with transforming culture and to remove some of the obstacles. So my initial answer would be the first two, but that's also a logical statement given that Cotter set this up to be a sequence of stages. Having said that, it's important to recognize in this model that you don't do step one, then move to step two, and then leave step one behind. You start with step one, you move through all the steps, but even when you're like at steps 6 and 7, you're still back trying to make sure people recognize the criticality of this effort still. So it's almost more of a circle process than it is a single linear process. But as a starting point, I would say getting the message out as to why we need to make this transformation of safety culture is critical, and having the right people involved in the coalition who can actually move the message forward and make the changes necessary for it to be successful.
Thank you, Nick. It does look like we have one other question coming in, so while we are waiting to see if that comes in, would you mind discussing the results of the poll question?
Well, it's interesting. It seems that there's a, largely speaking, they're all equally absent from the group of participants today, which is perhaps somewhat expected if these are common factors from the literature that show need to be in place and are important for a successful transformation of culture. Presumably those that are seeking to transform their culture are noting some of the obstacles they may have in place, and it seems to be almost even split across all these particular factors being absent from the organizations.
Thank you, Nick. And I am going to move you over to the presentation. If the question comes in, we will address it at the end of the next section. And now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Rudy for his section.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to get into a few key insights that were takeaways for me. And I know that the Cotter model was an important element of the domestic scan, but we also recognize that the Cotter model is just one change model. I think that it has some good aspects, as Nick had pointed out, in all of those steps that have to be considered in adapting whatever change model the agency or organization is going to use. You have to look at those elements in the Cotter model and how they can be applied. But the other takeaway from the domestic scan for me was the aspect of affecting personal safety behaviors and how some of the groups were developing programs that would key in on that to affect and change someone's behavior, to think about their own personal behaviors, because often we think about behavioral side, but it has to become personal or influential on a small group of folks initially. You can start out broadly, but when you key in on the individual, you're going to get a lot more payoff when you're focusing on changing behavior. So as Nick said, the Cotter model was a good starting point for us, but we understand that the surveyed participants didn't formally adopt the Cotter model. We were just trying to tie it back to steps that people could understand as they want to look at influencing or changing their organization's culture. And all of us can think back during our careers of times when maybe change was forced throughout the institution, the agency. Maybe it didn't go too well. There were a lot of hard feelings. It was coming top down, and you shall do this. Sometimes change happens kind of gradually. If you think back during the recession, Nevada especially was hit hard, and we had to have a series of cutbacks, hiring freezes. A lot of states had to have layoffs. So things happen, and then it changes an agency's culture. You might not even notice, but when you're trying to adopt a change or make some changes to your agency's safety culture, there might be some things that have been through the years affected it without you even understanding it or having that intent. So definitely the Cotter model was a good guide for changing an organization's culture. One of the key things was to establish that sense of urgency. We heard from Minnesota DOT and the Minnesota Department of Administration about the MinSafe program. And SAFE was the acronym, Safety Accountability for Everyone. And it was driven by the governor in that state who wanted to reduce workplace injuries, get those savings in insurance costs from property and liability that could be recouped if they implemented a strong safety program. And they were obviously focused on measuring each agency's safety performance in those areas so they could see establish goals and have very clear guidance and direction. So when I look at applying that to my state's DOT, there's several things that I can latch on to establish that sense of urgency with our employees. And unfortunately, we've seen this increase in fatalities on our roads. We were enjoying a downturn in fatalities and serious injuries for several years. Then the last 3 years, through 2015, we've seen a significant increase. It's very much a concern to the Department of Transportation and the State Board of Transportation. One thing that's unique in Nevada is that the governor chairs the State Board of Transportation, along with some other constitutional officers. So it is unique in the establishment of our board and the makeup. So it's going straight to the governor. The news or the reports on fatalities are provided every month at the Transportation Board meetings. Unfortunately, we also had a tragic event last year, just about a year ago. One of our maintenance workers was performing some maintenance work on the shoulder in a work zone, and an inattentive truck driver just veered right over just at the wrong time, wrong place for our worker. He was hit by that truck and killed. And very heartbreaking event. Like I said, it's only been a year, and just recently spoke with his mother, who was at the memorial event. It was a very tragic and touching situation for us. That could be used to establish that sense of urgency for protecting our workers. And as well as in our work zones, we've had some issues with inattentive drivers either causing serious injuries or fatalities for our contractors. So any one of these can be used to establish that sense of urgency for highway traffic safety, safety of our employees, safety in our work zones. One of the takeaways from the presenters for the MinSafe program was if you don't get the right people involved from the start, it's not going to happen. And that's creating that powerful coalition that Nick had talked about in the Cotter model. They took it to a department-wide safety committee in the DOT, and as I mentioned, every state agency had to form these powerful guiding coalitions within their own groups. And there was an overarching group of all the state agencies that was associated with MinSafe, but each agency had to be responsive and develop their plan to achieve their goals. But they had a lot of upper management participation at the DOT in Minnesota. So they were successful in forming that powerful guiding coalition and looking at those performance measures. In Nevada, obviously looking at transforming our safety culture more aggressively, we definitely see my role as the director of the Department of Transportation and the role of communication to all employees. We have different means of communicating with our employees, but I think that you have to have constant communication about this issue of that you are transforming your and you have to put your money where your mouth is. You have to pay for people's travel to participate in meetings. You have to attend those meetings and give a lot of support needed to those groups that are forming that guiding coalition with the director and the director's office. We're a centralized agency like many DOTs, and what I've seen, I worked a couple of years in a decentralized agency in Washington State DOT, and what I see in centralized agencies is often attributed to a specific division. That's safety division's job, to the safety culture is developed by, no, it's not. It's everyone's job. So you have to communicate that. And just as I gave the examples of anywhere from a maintenance worker to a construction worker to looking out for the fatality and serious injury statistics for the entire state on our state and local roads, it's everyone's job, and that's what has to be communicated as you form that coalition. So in Nevada, we have the headquarters divisions, the districts, and a lot of professionals that we built up in the communications area as well, so they can be very helpful. They're professional folks that know how to get the messaging out and use different forms of media, as well as the things that we're getting into with social media. They're using a lot more stuff online, videos of the director speaking to that issue, so that I can get the word out both internally and externally on our safety culture and the need to improve it and achieve certain goals. I really enjoyed Granite's presentation. They used a program developed by Caterpillar Safety Services called Speak Up and Listen Up. And one of the things that's difficult for people to do is to confront someone else when they see unsafe behavior. So they made it about addressing those safety issues. For instance, someone that's trying to cut a board and resting that board on his thigh and he's sawing. It's something that we would laugh about, but when you're on the go in a construction site, you can see this type of unsafe behavior exhibited. Are you going to go up to that guy that's worked 20 years for that contractor and you're maybe only have been there for a couple of years and you want to tell them that what you're observing is unsafe? It's very difficult. So they train people on how to have that kind of conversation, a difficult conversation with a coworker. How do you handle when they're pushing back, or I've worked here for 20 years. You're just a newbie. You don't know. So it was a very effective video campaign for training their employees on to speak up and listen up, and that establishes the expectation for their employees. So the other thing was a safety training video that Granite used where the employee was reminded of their responsibility to their family members. So once again, making it very personal to influence their behavior. The person thought, well, I can go do this job activity really quick. I don't have to put on my protective equipment. And he looks down, and there's his family looking up at him, and he feels a sense of obligation to them, the love there, the personal feelings to his family, and he puts on his protective equipment. And that image, burns into those employees' mind that watch that safety video. They start thinking in that manner. So it really can influence their behavior. And one of the things that I was aware of was what Idaho had developed as an ad campaign to deal with that issue of personal confrontation and the sense that we typically want to avoid confrontation. But would you personally confront someone if you're having a party or you're at a bar and you see someone that's obviously impaired? And would you tell them, hey, no, wait, have a couple cups of coffee, just relax, stop drinking, why don't you stay the night? Whatever it is, it was an ad campaign that was very focused on putting someone in that situation where they had to confront somebody. Would you do that? That was the point of that ad campaign. Very effective and thought-provoking ad campaign. So the appeal to influencing personal behavior is important, but we have to see our roles as someone that has maybe something to save a life. Would you personally take that step with someone? So those are some of my takeaways, but definitely it's a complex challenge to change one's safety culture as an organization. I think of my role as director, but it has to be more than me. It has to be more than the governor and the transportation board. Obviously, it has to involve all our employees, forming that strong coalition, empowering them, working with them, giving them the tools they need. So having that leadership, that vision, that employee engagement and communication are very critical to changing one's safety culture. And as I mentioned, the Cotter change model is just one of many change models. It's a template, but it has good, solid elements to it that are building blocks that you can use to change your safety culture in your organization. But definitely, I wanted to underscore that point that each organization has to look at their own. As I said, we're centralized. It might be different for a decentralized agency. You might have different rules or different budget constraints. So you have to look at those things. But typically, you will have those leaders and people that just are chomping at the bit to help out and form that coalition within each agency. And then appealing to each person's personal responsibility. You think back to how when we had to, through the decades ago, had to start using seatbelts. It wasn't always that way, where people wore seatbelts in the state vehicles, or didn't use cell phones in state vehicles. Before laws were changed, you most likely had to have a policy in place. And policies are fine, but to appeal to someone's personal responsibility each day, where they think about that constantly, is one way that you can achieve that improvement in your organization's safety culture. And definitely, we have to think broadly, our employees, our contractors, and the users of the transportation system as a whole, because we have a lot of influences out there. We have a lot of responsibilities. Jamie?
Thank you very much, Rudy. And now we're going to open up the chat pod again for any questions that you may have for Rudy and what he just discussed. Going back to the chat pod, we did have one. It wasn't so much a question but more a comment that the recent increases in fatalities nationwide would seem to be a tragic but more important impetus for change for safety culture. And it does look like we have a couple questions coming in. While we're waiting on those, I am going to go to the next poll break. And this question is, in order to transform its safety culture, an organization must rely on the Cotter change model. Is this true or false? Rudy, the question that we have that came in for you is, where can I find an example of an initial exploratory survey to measure the values, beliefs, etc. of my organization?
Wow, that's a great question, and the Safety Center is actually trying to get more states, state DOTs involved. I don't know, Nick, how many, or Jamie, if you know how many are participating, but Nevada is one of those, and it's a very quick web survey that you can get from the Safety Center. Usually we want, the Safety Center is focused at an organization's safety culture, so they want the director or the secretary of transportation of the organization to send that throughout the organization for people that have, the workers that have an influence on your safety goals. So you might have safety goals externally on fatalities and serious injuries, or you might have some safety goals that are more internal on worker injuries or lost time accidents, those types of things. But it is a good survey that gets at a sense of the organization's safety culture. And then that online survey gets distilled into a report. It's confidential. It doesn't identify any respondent to the survey specifically, but that gets rolled into a report back to that CEO or whoever the lead person is. So definitely through the Rural Traffic Safety Center, you can get that online survey and maybe be the champion within your organization and discuss that with your leadership if that's possible.
Thank you, Rudy, and I will let Nick address that as well in 1 second. Chris Poole did also post in the chat pod that the National Safety Council has a generic template as well that can be used to measure those. But Nick, did you want to address the survey that you were doing?
Yes. In fact, we're hoping to follow up with attendees with some information about that later. But essentially, we're developing a survey instrument which is tailored specifically to state and local traffic safety agencies to capture various aspects of organizational safety culture around those organizations which are responsible for traffic fatality. It's based around a model of culture that we find is useful in not only describing an agency's culture, but it also allows that agency to identify what aspects of culture they may want to focus on transforming to reach their goal. So it also helps develop strategies for changing culture, not only describing the current level of culture. But hopefully we can send out some more information about that after the seminar today.
Thank you, Nick. And Rudy, it looks like the poll is now closed and the results are broadcasted if you would like to address those.
Sure. Just once again, we felt that the Cotter change model was a good model, but we felt that it wasn't necessary that they must use that Cotter change model. I think that there's several change models out there and constantly probably new ones each year for corporate America, but we felt that you have to use some kind of process that is more in stepwise fashion. Think of all those elements that are in the Cotter change model, but it's really not necessary to rely just on that Cotter change model. We thought it was a good model to shape our survey around, so we got more direct information around those things that are elements of that change model. But we felt that it was more leave it up to each organization, each agency to adopt the change as they see fit. They don't necessarily have to rely on the model.
Thank you, and thank you once again, Rudy, for presenting for us. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Our next presenter is going to be Mike Tooley from MDT.
Good morning, and thank you. All right. Just like Rudy, I drew some things from some of the presenters, specifically all of them. They all had great things to say and definitely have a strong safety culture. So we had the right people to talk to. However, I also took a look at not only a state agency, but heavy highway construction. So my two examples are going to also focus on MnSafe and Granite Construction. I don't think that's a surprise, being the leader of a state agency myself and also involved in heavy highway construction, that those would appeal to me. I really was impressed with MnSafe and how they approached it. Safety for MnSafe for the state of Minnesota, they came to the conclusion early that it has to be a priority, if not the priority, of leadership. It has to be more than just talk, because this is going to require investments of energy and resources that somebody lower in the organization may not be able to direct. So it has to come from the very top. As a matter of fact, in the Minnesota example, previously safety was housed deep within the bureaucracy in a place called corporate services. And when they decided to take this step, they moved it from that area into the director's office. So it reported directly to the CEO of the organization. And that was very important. When you talk about creating a sense of urgency, management wanted to reduce workers' compensation claims. And not only did they just want to reduce them, they decided how much. And they chose a 25% reduction as their target for workers' compensation claims. Top management was held accountable for those results, and of course the governor had his commissioners, as shown here, sign his proclamation, his commitment. Each and every one of the departments then were on board and were held accountable quarterly. And so when the reports come out, you can not only see how your department is doing, but also how you compare to others. And this is accountability at a very high level in a number of different areas. If you are not making the grade, you know it, and so do all your peers. And so that keeps the pressure on, because what gets measured gets done. And so they work towards that by holding each other accountable in quarterly reports. Granite Construction was also a very interesting group to hear from. The very first question that the presenter asked us was, is safety your top priority back home? And of course everybody raised their hand, but then the follow-up question is, if it is, then how do you protect your employees? And in the case of state DOTs, it's true. We generally use orange cones or other devices that are easy to move, that really don't offer a lot of protection to our employees from vehicles moving through the work zone. Then if that's the case, then maybe our priority actually is budget or smooth flow of traffic versus safety. So it caused us, and those types of questions should be asked, it causes you to think, is safety your priority? And if you're taking these types of measures, you need to think harder about whether or not that is actually true and make the changes you need to make. So you need to think and do things differently. Now, Granite Construction was not unlike the rest of us at one point. For quite a while, the management of the organization knew that 20% of their workers were being injured. And the way they looked at it was, it meant that 80% were not. So we're doing pretty good. But that's not true. The safety manager thought the number should actually be 0, and prevailed upon management to realize that's true, because it's not only costing the company in terms of money and production, it's costing their employees and their families. serious issues at home when their workers are recovering from these injuries. So you don't just rely on statistics such as having an 80% success rate. You need to tell the story of why this is important. Also, management, it can't be ignored. They have to be involved and actually get into the field. You can't manage safety from the corner office. You need to go out and see exactly what your workers are doing. You need to take everything seriously, including near misses. Near misses are just a major incident that didn't quite happen. It's okay to treat new employees differently. Granite Construction did an analysis and realized that most of those workers that were injured were fairly new on the job. And so how they took steps to address that is they actually put a red helmet on the new workers for a minimum of 30 days until they clearly demonstrate that they understand the safety principles of working on a granite job. And it also allows more seasoned workers to keep an eye on the new person and help them through those 30 days. So it's pretty important. It's okay to treat the employees differently, and they're new and they need the extra protection. Granite on the jobs, they have a daily safety meeting and they discuss the plan of the day. And as often happens in heavy highway construction, sometimes things change. And if they do, Granite stops what they're doing and they meet again and talk about the change in the plan. They make safety number one. If you look at their code of conduct on their company website, they put that front and center, top of the list, before everything else. It's more than just words. It's an actual value in their code of conduct. So in summary, there's some common factors in both the public and the private sector examples that I have used. Number one, safety starts and ends with leadership. Just like Rudy mentioned, everybody is involved, everybody is responsible for safety, and safety is a core value of the organization. Those safety practices are continuously reviewed and evaluated. Don't forget about near misses. Those are very, very important because you were lucky, and you need to take and pay attention to those. And then finally, you have to have a plan that you can talk about and a goal that can be measured. Remember, we all know in our line of work, what gets measured gets done. In both cases, in MinSafe and in Granite Construction, they take that very seriously. And management to the top levels are looking at those reports and holding people accountable. And Jamie, back to you.
Thank you very much. And once again, we are going to take questions over in the chat pod. It does look like we have a few over there for you already. I am going to switch over to our poll question so people can answer that as well. This poll question is, which of the following is most critical to establishing a safety culture in an organization? Is it management and labor work together to create effective policy? Individuals take responsibility for their own safety? Executive leadership champions the safety efforts of the organization, or having measurable safety goals? And again, while we are waiting for you guys to fill out those polls, our first one is that DOTs are doing more with less. How do you keep safety as the highest priority when the trade-offs are often cost and productivity? Mike?
That's a great question. Thinking back to Granite Construction again, sometimes they will do less with less. As a matter of fact, if you don't write strong safety specifications into your projects, they will not bid a job. They know it costs money, but safety is important to them. We need to think that way as well as state DOTs. We all too often look very hard at more product to the expense sometimes of the safety of our workers. And Granite and some other large companies, frankly, will not bid jobs that don't have a strong safety component in it. So when it comes to safety, you may have to just realize you're going to wind up doing less with less.
Thank you, Mike. One additional question for you came in. How do you encourage honest reporting of behaviors and near misses?
That's another good question. And, you know, near misses are nothing to be ashamed of. And actually, I think probably the best way to address that isn't through necessarily punishing those that report the near miss or had the near miss, but instead rewarding reporting of that and making a show of the fact that this was an accident that really was prevented, whether it be luck or otherwise. Let's take the time to learn from this so that if this type of incident occurs again, that we have already responded to it and we don't even have the incident. It's good. It's better to be proactive than reactive, and I think encouraging that is probably the way to approach it.
And I have now closed the poll question for you and also broadcasted those results, so you should be able to see those and address that as well.
Thank you, Jamie. And the leader is A, management and labor work together to create effective policy. And that's true. It's management's job to create the atmosphere of safety initially. They have to be the leaders. But you can't do it without labor working with you. One of the presenters did mention the fact, though, that you have to be careful to maintain the leadership of management because sometimes labor will use these as opportunities to negotiate, and that's not what it's about. The whole point is to create a much safer workplace, and that ultimately needs to start with management.
And thank you once again, Mike. We really do appreciate you taking the time today to present for us.
Welcome.
Our next presenter is Mark Shelton from Missouri DOT, and he's the district engineer. Mark?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar this morning. I wanted to go over a few key insights learned from the scan, because as we read the answers to the questionnaires that those we scanned sent in, and then as we listened to their presentations, it really became obvious, and Nick mentioned this earlier, that there are factors or conditions, if you will, that are present within organizations with strong safety cultures. And so for my portion of the presentation, I'd like to share with you 3 of those factors that kind of rose to the top in my mind as some of the more important factors involved with safety cultures. And one of those is that safety goals are formalized in organizations' planning and strategic documents. Another one is that there is open communication within the organization about safety programs and goals. And then finally, the organization has a democratic style of management and leadership based on worker input. So what I'd like to do, and we'll get started, is talk about each one of them and share with you some examples from the organizations that we scanned during this scan. For the safety goals in an organization's planning and strategic documents, Washington State was one that really came to mind. They were actually the very first state to write down in their documentation that they had a clear and verifiable goal of 0 traffic deaths and serious injuries on their roadways by 2030. The Federal Highway Administration also has. I didn't get that. Could you read? The Federal Highway Administration also has a Towards Zero Death policy listed in their documentation. And then, of course, we've heard a couple times about MinSafe and their goal of reducing workplace injuries by 25% across the state. And that came from the governor. Mike showed some illustrations where that was in their leading documents. And the key to all this is that goals, these safety goals, they can't just be in a memo. They can't just be led by the safety section. But organizations that have a strong safety culture actually have those safety goals in their organizational planning and strategic documents right up there with the productivity and profit portions of their goals for the organization. Next is that open communication about safety programs and goals. A couple illustrations that we'll talk about this morning is Monsanto. Monsanto, their CEO, has a quarterly virtual town hall meeting that goes across the entire organization to communicate their values and successes. The key thing about that is that safety is prominent as one of their core values. It's given attention. It's on the agenda, if you will, for all of their quarterly meetings. The Iowa DOT uses a variety of methods, whether it's through social media, dynamic message boards, weekly newsletters from their director. And some of those dynamic message board messages they'll get your attention. Things like surfing and driving, dumb use of a smartphone. Those things to get out communication in a way that catches people's attention. Again, with MenSafe, after they had went through their program to reduce injuries by 25%, they followed up then with continuing on that growth with a 5% annual injury reduction measure. And with the Federal Highway Administration, Every Day Counts. And Every Day Counts is all about promoting the adoption of proven innovations, partnering with other agencies and stakeholders, identifying, promoting, and deploying successful strategies to improve transportation safety. You know, the first two examples from Monsanto and the Iowa DOT have to do with what I would call the raw communication. It's just kind of getting the information, getting started, getting the information out. With MenSafe and the Federal Highway Administration, it's about that continual follow-up on whether the goals change and grow, or sharing the new ideas. You know, sometimes we think that if we say it once, that's good enough. Everybody's heard it, everybody understands it. And really, in reality, that's the farthest thing from the truth. We have to continually, through a variety of ways, get our communication, our safety communication out. Organizations, the democratic style of management and leadership. Monsanto is an organization that I'd like to talk about for a minute. You know, it's interesting, in Monsanto's questionnaire, they didn't check the box that they had a democratic style of leadership. But something I want you to think about, they do have a safe driver training. Whether those employees are inside or outside the company. And what the thing to realize is that training actually is empowering to employees. It gives employees and others the ability to know the correct details, to know how to make good choices. Granite Construction's companies speak up and listen up. And it's all about empowering employees to identify and voice concerns about unsafe behaviors with their fellow employees. And we all know how easy it is to sort of look at your shoes when we see something that needs to be corrected in a coworker, because that's the boss's job to fix and not mine. Granite actually is working to break down that barriers and empower employees to speak up to other employees when they see unsafe behavior. And finally, the Iowa DOT actually has a grant program with dedicated funding to provide resources to support safety programs on any public road. It's a vision that it's not restrained to within the organization, and that's a sign of a maturing safety culture. So in summary, the documents that guide the organization, they have to have the safety goals in it. Again, safety has to be right up there with production and profits if it's really going to be the value that moves the culture. You can't communicate and share best practices too much. Over and over again, through a variety of different ways, we have to continually communicate about best practices, that we're a safety-oriented organization, and the things we're doing to move that culture. And then finally, we need to ask ourselves the question, are employees speaking up? Are you comfortable with all your efforts? As I think about that, the culture within the organization, that's kind of where we're comfortable. If we're talking about moving a safety culture, we probably ought to be uncomfortable sometime. Because if we're always comfortable, we have to ask ourselves, are we really moving that culture? Jamie, back to you.
Thank you, Mark. And again, while we're waiting to see if there are any questions, I'm going to switch over to our last poll question. You can ask any questions you may have over on the left-hand side in the chat pod. Our poll question for you is, which of the following factors are present in organizations with strong safety culture? Is it worker input and training, clear published goals, frequent safety communications, or all of the above? And Mark, while we're waiting to see if any other questions come in, one that I do have for you is, what is the best way to communicate safety programs and goals?
Really, I don't know that there is a best way other than use your communication tools. We have so much available to us now, whether it's internet, whether it's for DOTs, dynamic message boards. We have availability face-to-face, just whatever method. The social media seems to be really effective among some of our younger target audiences. But the idea of just using whatever communication methods available and use it over and over and over again.
Thank you, Mark. And I am now going to end the poll question, and the results are now broadcasted for you if you'd like to go over those results as well.
Sure, and really that all of the above. And I think that, that's important to recognize. And, we've seen there's a variety of factors that influence safety culture. The Cotter Model of change doesn't just have one step. There's 8 steps. There's not just one thing that moves safety cultures, but cultures are about how we live our lives and how we do our things, and it's going to take a lot of different methods in order to move us forward. But certainly training, clearly laying out the goals, and continuing the communication, all working together will help us get there.
Thank you once again, Mark. We really do appreciate you also taking the time to speak for us today.
You're quite welcome.
And Nick, I'm going to turn over the webinar to you to wrap it up.
Very good. So my goal here is just to sort of a quick wrap up of some of the key insights that I felt were important. And quite simply, looking broadly over all the things that the different organizations said, looking at the different factors they had in place that led to success, looking at the different ways they responded to each stage of the transformation process. I think a couple of key issues come into play. First of all, at the root of all these efforts to transform culture is the effort to increase the perceived value of safety within the organization. In the end, that's at the core of any effort to transform culture, especially if we define culture as values. all the different strategies that we saw these organizations engage in, the heart of it was trying to get everybody to place safety as the number one value, not just in words, but in practice. So that was key. The second, especially with some of the more innovative type of strategies to transform safety culture, was the effort to make safety personal, to create a bond amongst all members of the organization so that they felt that they were in it together, not only for their own safety, but for the safety of those that they work with. So that, in a sense, making a safer work environment and creating a safer culture became part of their social, if not moral, responsibility as coworkers who identify together and felt a bond together, that they shared this mission together, and that it was personally meaningful to them to achieve this goal together. Third thing worth mentioning, which I think is worth bearing in mind, when we're going in to look at our organization's safety culture, there may be a fear of finding something we don't want to know about. Having some fear that our culture is a complete disaster and it's going to be embarrassing, and that's not always the case. A number of the strategies that we heard from these organizations, yes, there were some aspects of their culture that needed some work, but there are also, within those same organizations, some very positive, very strong cultural aspects that the organization could leverage, could build on to achieve their goal. So I think an important thing to recognize if you're thinking about wanting to measure and transform your culture is to not be fearful that it's all going to be bad news. Quite often there is very good news that comes out of this effort, and it's those areas of good news that you can build on and leverage on to get momentum and traction to move forward with your overall goals for transforming culture. I mean, one of the organizations that we heard from, in the example that we heard in the previous presenters, recognizing that within the existing organization, although it had aspects of the culture that were problematic, there are also very positive ones, such as the workers' close connection to their family and using the implications of the workers' safety for the family's well-being as a way of leveraging the goals of the safety strategy. So even though at a particular time workers may not be focusing on their own safety, when they realize the impact of an injury to them on their family, that positive aspect of culture motivated them to take the corrective action. So overall, three themes. Number one is, at the heart of all this is to have everybody perceive and believe and embrace that safety is number one, not just say it as sound bites, but actually walk the walk and talk the talk and take the actions to make it evident that safety is number one, which means changing things in most parts. Number two is creating a social bond amongst all workers, recognizing that everybody's responsible for safety, and not just their own safety, but those people around them. And number three is not being afraid to learn about what our culture is, because even though there may be some areas that may need some change, some improvement, there's also a lot of positive aspects of our cultures that we can leverage and use that as a jumping off point to move forward with our goal of transforming culture and having a safer work environment. Back to you, Jamie.
And once again, as the wrap-up, we just wanted to see if there were any final questions for any of our speakers. If so, you can put those into the chat pod over on the left-hand side. And Nick, I guess while we're seeing if there are any questions, if you'd like to go through the learning outcomes as well, and we'll see if anyone types anything in.
As a result, we tried to organize this webinar around these key learning outcomes. We began with discussion of the basic methodology we use for this scan. I presented some information defining what we mean by organizational safety culture and how that helped structure our survey and data collection methods. I listed some of the factors that many of these organizations who were able to successfully achieve a safer culture felt were important to have in place as they began to engage these efforts. Also talked about the Cotter Model as just one example of a process that an organization can go through to achieve its goal of transforming its culture. There are other models that are out there, but it is probably important to recognize that going through a systematic process is important to success. And lastly, we heard from a number of the members from the SCAN panel about the different kinds of key insights they felt they had garnered from the data collection process in this domestic scan.
And once again, I wanted to thank all 4 of our speakers from today. We really do truly appreciate you guys taking the time out to come and share your experiences with us, and also just the fact that you were able to be a part of this scanning process itself and documenting some of these results so that it can be used nationwide across the country as lessons learned and best practices. So thank you for making that available to everyone. I also wanted to let everyone on the webinar know of a couple upcoming things. The Safety Center will be doing our April webinar on April 28th at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. It is called Crash Risk Factors for Low Volume Roads, and Oregon DOT case study, and that will be presented by a staff member from the Western Transportation Institute, and we'll be talking about a research project that was done for Oregon DOT. We do also have a May webinar and June webinar scheduled as well, and those are available on our website under the Registration for Safety Center Trainings page. You can register right now for the April webinar. The May and June ones will be open soon. We do archive all of our webinars, and those are available on our archived Safety Center Trainings page. And this one will be up within a couple of days, both the PowerPoint and the streaming video, so that you can watch it. We also do have some training videos available. We have the What is the National Center for Rural Road Safety that was released in January of 2015. But more importantly, we have the Introduction to Road Safety Culture video, and that is a training video that was just released this January and was done by Nick Ward. And so that is available on our multimedia page on the Safety Center website. We are also having a National Working Summit on Transportation in Rural America. This summit will be a different format where instead of just having speakers, we will have our audience be part of the summit as well. The output for this summit will be white papers documenting what some of the transportation challenges and successes are for rural America. So we do encourage you to save the date, which is September 7th through 9th. 2016 in Denver, Colorado, but we do also have the registration now open for that summit if you are interested in attending. Again, we have that information up under news and events on our website, so you can find out more information there and register if you are interested in attending. And don't forget, you can also like us on Facebook and join our distribution list as well, which will get you all of the latest information from the Safety Center and let you know when all of our registrations are open for our trainings. So thank you all again for attending today. It looks like we did not have any final questions. Thank you one more time to all of our speakers as well. So everyone have a great day.